Okay, we will go ahead and get it started. I'm Bridget Crawford. I am the president of the American Tax Policy Institute and a professor at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar, Rewriting the Rules, Environmental Tax Policy in a Shifting Legal Landscape. The program is co-sponsored by the Pace Energy and Climate Center here at Haub Law, and we have the generous support of the Land Use and Natural Resources Law Center at Stanford University Cumberland School of Law. We're thrilled to be joined today by our moderator, Colin Lingle of the Pace Energy and Climate Change Center, who will be introducing our panelists. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm Colin Lingle of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. Our panelists today are Michael Homersky, the Executive Director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center and an adjunct professor at Pace. Seth Hanlon is a senior fellow at the Tax Law Center at NYU Law. Prior to that, Seth served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax and Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Tracy M. Roberts is a professor of law at Stanford University, Cumberland School of Law in Birmingham, Alabama. And Amish Shah is a tax attorney in Holland and Knight's Washington, D.C. office. So we're going to begin with an overview from Tracy Roberts. So I'll hand it over to you for 10 minutes.
I think Mike was going to go first. Is that correct?
That was my understanding, yeah.
Yes, I think Mike's up first. At least I have his slides up first. So Mike, whenever ready, whenever
Let's
you are.
do that. Maybe I'm reading off the wrong hymn book.
I'm ready.
Mike, go ahead.
Bridget, can you put up the slides?
Yes, I think I put up the slides.
I cannot see them.
You cannot see them. Okay, so let me try again.
But in the meantime, I am Mike Homersky. I am the executive director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center. I've been with Pace Law School for about 3 years now, first in the Land Use Law Center and now leading the Energy and Climate Center. Prior to that, I was in private practice for over 15 years. Really nothing exclusive to energy and climate. I was a corporate restructuring attorney, half in big law, half with my own firm. And I tell you that to note that although I've been in academia for the past 3 years, I have represented quite a few parties in the renewable energy space who are very directly impacted by, tax policy and tax credits, and certainly in the pre-IRA world of tax credits. So next slide, Bridget. Very simply, what is a tax credit, right? Tax credit is money that taxpayers can subtract from the income taxes they owe. This is different than a tax deduction, right? This is a dollar for dollar reduction. So if you have $500,000 of income and you owe $100,000 in taxes, a $40,000 tax credit will reduce the money you owe to the government from $100,000 to $60,000. If that was a tax deduction, by way of comparison, it would reduce your taxable income from $500,000 to $460,000. And, your $100,000 of liability would be like, I don't know, $98,000, $96,000 of liability. So these are dollar for dollar reductions. Tax credits are certainly not unique to the energy space. They ones that you typically hear of or know about are the earned income tax credit or, tax credits for investing in certain retirement accounts, because at the end of the day, what a tax credit is intended for is the government saying they are encouraging a particular type of behavior. In the energy space and the residential, the individual energy space, I have to say, ones you've probably heard of are the electric vehicle tax credit, right? $7,500 if you buy a certain electric vehicle that expires in about 3 weeks. And the residential solar credit, which has existed in some form on and off for probably over 40 years at this point. But right now, in its simplest term, from the federal government through the end of the year, if you put solar panels on your house, you get a 30% tax credit. If you are in certain states like New York, Massachusetts, you can also get a credit from the state as well. So a couple of years ago, if you put solar panels on your house, you'd get 30% from the feds and 25% from New York State, and you're actually getting, half of your money back in some sort of tax credits. The sort of major tax credits that exist for sort of corporate taxpayers in the renewable energy space. The first of which is the investment tax credit. Historically, this is targeted solar projects and kind of smaller renewables, and it's a very simple calculation, right? A straight percentage of the system cost, your investment cost, right? Mirroring the name. And quite simply, it's intended to incentivize investment, right? If you spend $1 million on solar, you'll get, $300,000 back. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I assume you'll have access to these if you wanted to reference them later on. I'm putting these up just to note that these investment tax credits, which got a ton of publicity in the Investment Reduction Act, which one of my colleagues is going to talk about in more detail shortly, have been around for a really long time, right? In some form or another, they have been around since 1978, right? They were smaller percentage, 10%, 15%, 15%, 12%, and mostly limited to solar. Wind pops up here and again. Next slide, please, Bridget. See, again, in all kinds of different forms of legislation, they existed in some way. There were a lot of extensions, and I think there were parts where they do lag, and they change every few years. So the lack of predictability was one of the criticisms of sort of the investment tax credit system that Congress has devised over the past 35 or so years, 45 or so years, really. Next slide. Again, see, the Congress sort of continues to tweak these and make them more attractive to investors in more recent history. Next slide, Bridget. Until finally, and again, one more. You can see how often these things change. Again, finally in 2022, when the Investment Reduction Act at the time, well, I guess it still does, seeks to lock it in for 10 years time, right? So it gives predictability to not only the parties doing the investment, but financiers, right? People can, should have been comfortable that if they make an investment in a big solar project, they'll have 10 years of predictability with investment tax credits. Although one of the major amendments, changes really in the Inflation Reduction Act to what has been being done before, is that it made these investment tax credits technology neutral. So it wasn't solely for solar, wind, geothermal, other types of renewable energy credits. And what was also sort of unique about the Inflation Reduction Act as industrial policy is that it sort of sought to incentivize other behaviors incidental to the investment, right? So you'd get additional credits for paying a prevailing wage, which that varies depending on the jurisdiction. You'd get additional credits if you built them in an energy community, which is a community that used to rely on fossil fuel, or a disadvantaged community. So this is the way that the government is using tax policy and energy policy to also influence other kinds of policy, like labor policy, right? Next slide, please. So the other big one that has been around for quite some time is the production tax credit. This has to do more on energy production over the years rather than sort of your upfront capital expenditure. So over the course of years, it's almost always 10 years. I'm not sure. I'm sure there were some exceptions to that, but most of the ones I'm familiar with are 10 years. You get paid a set price per unit of energy that you produce. And it's a fairly straightforward calculation, though you really have to, it's an ongoing sort of monitoring thing rather than a sort of one-time upfront credit. And this was historically targeted to wind and really large-scale renewables. Next slide, please. Again, similar to the investment tax credit, it's been around a while, not as long, right? This has only been around maybe 30 years. Yeah, 30 years or so. It's tough to see 1992 and realize that was like, 33 years ago, since I kind of remember it. But again, this is purely for illustrative reasons, showing how frequently this thing has been renewed, revised. Next slide. And one more slide. I lied, two more slides. Again, Inflation Reduction Act, much like the investment tax credit, it becomes technology neutral in 2022. It could be solar, it could be wind, it could be geothermal, and again, it ties in these bonuses like labor provisions, energy, community bonuses to incentivize other sorts of behavior that the then administration thought was, society, a benefit to society. So using financial incentives and tax credits to incentivize behavior. Next slide. So finally, we briefly touched on this in my introduction, the solar tax credit, the residential solar tax credit. Again, while it got a lot of publicity in the Inflation Reduction Act, it has been something that has been around for quite some time, started in 1978 by Jimmy Carter. It has changed a lot over its history, and I think more so than the ITC has gone away for longer periods of time. So the lack of predictability about the solar tax credit has been particularly a problem, particularly because the kind of parties who are using this are consumers, they're individuals who aren't, tax professionals. They aren't, big manufacturers who are relying on their advisors to ensure they capture every dollar. These are just people trying to put solar on their homes. And of course, in 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which at the time thought we locked in a solar tax credit for the next 10 years, but that tax credit is, I believe, going away at the end of this year. But other people will talk about the IRA and the changes that HR 1 has put into it. So in sum, right, tax credits are important because they are a government tool to incentivize behavior that any particular administration considers societal good, right? So not only, right, have we traditionally sought to incentivize clean energy because it's better for the environment. Over time, it's proven to be cheaper. It the recent tweaks to this kind of policy has also incentivized higher wages, right? Investing in communities that have been left behind, if you will. And this is basically industrial policy 101, right? The government using its tools and its arsenal to craft policy. The tax credits are one way to do it, to sort of bolster, assist, incentivize, prioritize certain industries and certain societal behaviors.
Thank you very much, Mike Komersky. We are going to transition now to Tracy Roberts, addressing the major provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act and how those were changed by the OB3, Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Thank you. While Congress has identified climate change as a problem as early as 1992, it waited 30 years to pass its first major climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. That act was groundbreaking in terms of its magnitude, of its expenditures, and its breadth. Nevertheless, as Mike indicated, this act was built on other tax provisions that were developed to support energy conservation, energy efficiency, and renewable energy development. Next slide. The investment tax credit and the production tax credit were first designed to support renewable energy. IRA included several innovations, as Mike mentioned. It makes the tax credits, the PTC and the ITC, technology neutral. And so while prior credits were limited to renewable energies, these are extended to fossil fuel energy and to nuclear energy. IRA, as Mike mentioned, provides bonus credits if certain labor or domestic content requirements are met, or if the projects are sited in locations that will enhance the equity or advance environmental justice concerns, or address those environmental justice concerns. And then finally, the IRA provided a direct payment and tax credit transfer options, which made it possible for state, local, and tribal governments and NGOs to use the tax credits. They had not been able to use those before. The OBBB terminates wind and solar eligibility for the ITC and the PTC, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But in addition, the phase outs were changed. The credits for other energy sources were extended to phase out through 2035, rather than phasing out based on meeting certain mandatory minimum GHG greenhouse gas reductions. There were bonus credits that were added for nuclear communities, people who live near and depend on nuclear facilities for their employment. And then it also added foreign entity of concern requirements. Those were in the IRA, and they were expanded or enhanced or made more strict under the O3B. Basically, the restrictions regulate ownership and control of the facilities, effective control of the facilities, material assistance. And so right now, the prohibited foreign entities are of concern. The countries from which those entities might have an affiliation are China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Given that most solar panels are today manufactured in China, and the components as well for a lot of renewable energy resources, this can further slow and stymie the production of renewable energy facilities even within the deadlines. Next slide. Wind and solar are the only two renewable energy forms that have taken significant market share from coal and natural gas over the last decade. So, with the next slide. Oh, sorry. Looks like, oh, somehow my screen is not showing your changes in slides. So the OBBB provides for wind and solar to be placed, they have to be placed in service by December 31st, 2027. This is an acceleration or bringing forward of the deadline. There's an exception if the buildings have begun, if the facilities have begun construction as of July 4th, 2026. While there has been in the traditional regs, there have been guidance, forms of guidance that provided that there was a safe harbor for establishing beginning of construction. That safe harbor has been modified, so no credits are allowed for wind and solar facilities that are unless those facilities are low output solar projects or the projects have met the safe harbor, but before September 2nd, 2025. I'm not seeing the slides.
I'm trying.
Okay. All right. So I'll just continue given our short time frame. The next slide is about other kinds of credits. There was a credit for nuclear energy. In addition, there was a new zero emission nuclear power production tax credit that was available for facilities that did not receive an allocation of PTCs under the era of 2009. That credit was extended through 2035. Again, there's a foreign entity ownership credit provisions that are going to limit the use of that credit. And then there's a hydrogen credit for up to $3 per kilogram of qualified clean hydrogen. The phase out for the hydrogen PTC was accelerated from 2032 to the end of 2027. Let's talk about carbon sequestration. That's a little bit before this slide. The way that fossil fuels may qualify for clean energy PTCs and ITCs and for clean fuel incentives is through carbon sequestration technologies. Carbon sequestration removes CO2 from industrial processes or from direct air capture, and it deposits it within deep rock formations. The IRA turbocharged the existing credit scheme by reducing the minimum plant size and increasing the credit to up to $130 per metric ton sequestered for direct capture facilities that met certain labor requirements. The OB3 allows captured CO2 instead of being deposited to be used in fracking projects. There are FEOC rules and also some inflation adjustments. Next slide. There are some qualifying advanced energy property credits. They're allocated for manufacturing clean energy, clean vehicle, and clean fuel facility components. These are allocated credits. That means the IRS has to approve the award before the taxpayer can claim it, and then the taxpayer must qualify by meeting the certification and placed in service deadlines. If they fail to do so in other kinds of credit schemes for allocation, those credits would go back into the pool. The OBBB prevents that any forfeited credits from being reissued to anyone else. And then the Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit supports the manufacture of clean energy, clean vehicle, and clean fuel components as well. And so that has a deadline of 12/31/29 for metallurgical coal, which has been added as an applicable critical mineral for use in steel manufacture, big boon to the steel industry. And then there are phase outs from 2033 to 2035 for other critical minerals. Next slide. There are a set of clean vehicle incentives. You've got a plug-in electric vehicle incentive for personal vehicles. There's a previously owned clean vehicle credit which is used vehicles. Both of these have a deadline of this month, the end of this month, 9/30/2025. For the plug-in electric, it's an acquisition deadline. For the previously owned clean vehicle credit, it is a placed in service deadline. And there's also a credit for commercial vehicles that has a placed in service deadline for the end of the month. Next slide. There were also alternative vehicle refueling property credits. And so these have a placed in service deadline of June 30th, 2026. There's a clean fuel production tax credit, and that the OBBB prohibits negative emissions rates. So technically, you could overcompensate for the emissions that are produced. This OB3 prohibits that kind of accounting, and it also excludes emissions from indirect land use changes. So to the extent that forests and peatlands are being converted into agricultural land to produce biofuels, then those increases in CO2 emissions from that conversion are not going to be counted. And then finally, it extends the credit for sales through the end of 2029. Next slide. There were also green residential building incentives, the energy efficient home improvement credit, which extends to weatherization for windows, doors, insulation, heat pumps. That has a placed in service deadline by the end of this year. Likewise, the residential clean energy credit, you have to undertake those expenditures for solar electric panels, solar water heaters, fuel cells, small winds, geothermal, heat pumps, and battery storage by the end of this year. And then there's also a new energy efficient home credit. So this is new construction. It was built in an energy efficient way. And so you've got a deadline of June 30th, 2026 to acquire the home to claim that credit. Next slide. There also, wonderfully, there was a clean energy efficient commercial building deduction. And so the beginning of construction deadline for that has been accelerated to June 30th, 2026. Next slide. And finally, there is an enhancement to capital markets for income from hydrogen storage, carbon capture and storage, advanced nuclear, hydropower, and geothermal energy. Since all of this income qualifies as qualifying income for publicly traded partnerships, investors can enjoy the benefit of partnership flow-through taxation, which is basically they enjoy the combination of a regular income source and a tax shelter for much of that income. So all of these combine to supercharge fossil fuels ultimately, and potentially carbon sequestration. Next slide. Of course, this has a cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Those are barely going to change. We can contrast in green where we would have been if we had left the IRA provisions in place. Where we need to be, net zero, that's the line in purple. And then where we actually are, this is the OBB that was final in the Senate. And so that's the gray line that barely changes where we are. And then next slide. finally, Americans are going to be spending more, not less, on energy, and that energy will have a much higher conventional as well as greenhouse gas pollution. So these are some of the impacts, and I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot more impacts over the next few minutes. Thank you.
Teresa Roberts, thank you so much for that introduction to this topic. We're going to open this up to a little more interactive type of discussion among our panelists. I'll start us off with asking each of our panelists to respond to the same question, which is, how significant are the changes that OB3 has made to the structure and substance of laws at the intersection of taxation and the environment? Or another way of asking that might be, how significant is OB3's rollback? First, we'll turn to Seth Hanlon.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, I think Tracy's presentation laid it out very well, especially the bottom line of the impact on emissions reductions. That there's just going to be a hugely negative in terms of, increase of emissions as a result of this law, and also higher electricity prices. And I think that's sort of the ultimate bottom line, that this is a giant, like really major, significant step back in the effort to reduce U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions and other economic goals. I did want to not be entirely negative and emphasize that there are major aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act that are very important and that remain in place, that endure after the OBBA. And so, I think if you look at IRA and OBBBA as a whole, it's kind of maybe two steps forward and one rather large step back. But there's still some good that remains. So I think, first of all, the core investment and production tax credits, that Mike had described, they're still in place. They're still in place well into the 2030s. They still have the same kind of enhanced rates and the same bonus provisions in terms of the labor requirements, and also the enhancements for locating in energy communities and low-income communities, enhancements for domestic content. So those are all essentially untouched, with the rather major exception that that wind and solar are really singled out for exclusion. So the wind and solar ITC and PTC essentially, and you essentially have to begin construction within 1 year of the bill's enactment. And then not only that, but then the administration recently took some action sort of post hoc after the law passed, to make it harder to establish that one has begun construction, that apply only for the wind and solar termination. Okay, but sorry, back to the good things. I think one thing to emphasize is that so for the ITC and PTC, energy storage remains fully eligible. So batteries, which are going to be an increasingly important part of as renewables become more important on the grid, batteries are going to be more important to store energy and to maintain dependability. The tax credits are still fully in place for other low emissions or zero emissions technologies like geothermal and new nuclear. Those will take longer than wind and solar to build out, for sure. But the law will certainly have an impact in accelerating those. And the clean energy manufacturing tax credit is still in place for batteries, for solar components, for inverters, and for other things, with the exception of wind components, which is cut off after 2027.
Okay, thank you, Seth. We do need to move on, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate the addition of good news. I really hate to interrupt good news, but we do need to turn to Amish Shah. You are muted, sir.
Yeah, someone in every session needs to do that once, and it'll be me this time. And I'm going to follow up on, I think, what Seth was talking about here, which is, look, it really was, when you look back at the history of the tax credits, these have changed over time. So, and we've had short-term extensions. The biggest issue that we had for a lot of years was, 1 year and 2 year extensions, situations where the credits went away, and as Mike was saying, they came back retroactively sometimes, and you had a lot of starts and stops that made it much more difficult to plan. Um, and these have changed over, the last 20 some odd years, 30 years that have been seeing this. They've changed significantly over time. And so when I look at, what happened during the IRA, what it really gave us, as others mentioned, was finally gave us a long-term extension of these tax credits. And we knew they were going to be around for much longer than a year or 2 years, which was the case most of the time prior. So that was one of the big benefits. It also did some things that were certainly socially favorable. As Mike mentioned, it gave us prevailing wage and apprenticeship rules. It gave us energy community rules. It gave us domestic content rules, and those have a lot of terrific social impacts. But from a pure perspective of getting the tax credits, it creates a lot of hurdles as well. So if you look at prevailing wage and apprenticeship, the amount of I can't tell you a single project that I know of that is not trying to get the prevailing wage and apprenticeship bump up, right? If you don't meet that, you lose 80% of your tax credit. And it is a big lift. We talk to in-house folks regularly who are tax people who are trying to become labor experts. We're trying to do that as well. But the market's adjusted. The market is resilient. The market is adjusted to that requirement, even though it's a very heavy lift in the IRA. One things we're seeing here is, again, we've got some heavy lifts here. The new bill, one of the biggest things that's come out of this are the foreign entity of concern rules, as was mentioned. And, again, everyone out there that is in this space is trying to figure out these rules, trying to figure out how they worked. We've had lots of conversations. I know Seth and others have been talking regularly with others in the industry to figure out how these apply. And industry has really been shifting their efforts. So, as difficult as some of these challenges are around FIAC, around PWA, I think industry has been good about overcoming some of these challenges to continue moving forward. Look, certainly one of the big, in terms of the extensions or the rollbacks, I think there was a fear that this could have been much worse in the OB3, and the fact that we had most of these credits available, at least on the commercial side, up through the 2030s for beginning construction was generally fairly welcome news. Now on wind and solar, as Seth mentioned, we have the shorter time period, and there was a lot of angst when the executive order came out right after the OB3 passed that said that Treasury shall be directed to issue new guidance for beginning construction. And again, the fear was that guidance would create much stricter rules for beginning construction for wind and solar. And as others mentioned, it took away the 5% safe harbor methodology for beginning construction, but it left in place the physical work test kind of unchanged from what historically had been used. And I say most often we do see folks using the physical work test. And so again, the good news there on wind and solar is the rules for beginning construction, for the physical work test haven't changed. As long as you began construction by July 3rd of 2026, you are able to continue building the project and get the tax credit. And if you're done by if you begin construction 2026 before July 3rd, 2026, you have until the end of 2030 to complete the project. So what we're seeing are a lot of wind and solar developers doing a lot of work to begin construction so that we can continue to see development out through the end of 2030. So again, I think part of my theme is it's not great, but I think there's a sense from industry, at least from the folks we talked to, that certainly could have been much worse.
That's great, Amisha. Thank you so much. Next, responding to the question, how significant is OB3's rollback? Mike Komersky.
Sure. And I appreciate Seth and Amisha's attempts to spin this positively. And for industry, it's probably not as devastating as it is for the environment, for investment in clean energy, in household bills. This is, and while some technologies came out fine in this, right? Battery storage, as Seth noted, geothermal, biofuels, hydrogen cells are back, I guess. It reminds me of, other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? It's devastating. It's devastating for emissions. Our air is going to remain dirty. It's devastating for investment $22 million of clean energy projects has been canceled in 2025 alone. Tens of thousands of jobs will be lost as a result. So while the administration wants to talk about bringing back American manufacturing, this does quite the opposite. Um, and it's devastating for American consumers, right? Electricity bills are already skyrocketing costs at rates not seen in years. And by, most nonpartisan estimates, this is going to lead to multiple hundreds of dollars of electricity costs for an average US household. For what? What's the benefit here? What did we get out of this? Uh, I don't see much benefit in most of the rollbacks, but we get dirtier air, higher electricity bills, and less jobs. But storage is going to be around. It's devastating.
So we'll take the next round for just brief comments on anything that we have touched on here. Just again, extremely brief, so we can use some of that time for Q&A. But Tracy Roberts, if you had any final remarks, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that we need to take into consideration is that our landscape is changing economically and institutionally and legally. There are increasingly the grid is you're having drawdowns from the use of artificial intelligence. And so as a result, there are spikes and peaks, and there's enormous demand for a completely new industry or a largely new industry. And so that is going to, especially in a place like Alabama, which almost exclusively has depends on coal, that's going to have a huge effect. The other legal institutional context that we need to take into account is that the Trump administration is using not only the Department of Treasury to change certain regulations in order to kind of stymie solar and wind, but they're also using the Department of Health and Human Services to try to slow down and pause. That was an article in the New York Times today. And then finally, in terms of the off again and on again experience that we've had with the ITC and then changes in the PTC over time, all of the back and forth has depended on us being or a change in Congress. And so there are some institutional things that are changing that we cannot ignore in terms of trying to lock in gerrymandering to prevent Congress from changing over time. And so I think we need to think about all of these things in the context of what the future holds. In terms of the current economics, I think the most important thing to share with public is that even though demand for home modifications is very high, people want tax credits, want support around modifying their homes to make them more energy efficient and to use renewable energy. I think 83% of people who are surveyed in the United States and representative samples, they want these kinds of supports, and these are going away very soon. This is going to cost them about $50 billion over the next 10 years in terms of increased energy costs. And it's going to, and then on top of it, they are paying for the privilege because 80 billion is what's going to cost the taxpayer over the next 10 years to support these fossil fuel subsidies.
So thank you very much. Seth Hanlon, response to anything that's gone before or another very brief wrapping up comment.
Sure. No, I mean, I don't, I certainly, didn't mean to be sanguine. I think I'm more trying to avoid total despair in highlighting the things that do remain. I mean, and another thing I was going to point out is the direct pay and transferability mechanisms that I think were quite novel and quite successful are still in place. But I certainly agree with what Mike and Tracy were saying, and especially about the singling out of wind and solar and using all of this administration using really pulling all of the levers of government to block wind and solar deployment in really inexplicable ways, like stopping the construction of a offshore wind platform that's 80% done and was going to come online next year. And just from the goals that the administration has articulated for themselves, like increasing, domestic energy production, or as American energy dominance, as they call it, and lowering energy prices and electricity prices for household and businesses. Like these are just own goals. It's like we need wind and solar in the toolkit, and not and it's not just taking away subsidies, or but it's aggressive attacks to block the deployment of wind and solar.
Thank you very much. And Amisha, do you have responses to anything that has come up so far today? Once again, I believe there's a muting situation.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, sorry. No, I think the last few comments are certainly on point. I mean, there are broader issues that are, being created and challenged by the OB3, certainly, as others have noted. I think some of the perspective is we were expecting, something absolutely horrible, and so the expectations, I think, were so low that the bar was so low that it was certainly met in some respects. But the one thing I just mentioned is just on the transferability point that Seth alluded to. We were certainly happy to see that transferability was not taken away by by OB3 again. In terms of the things that we worried about before, certainly transfer market is as hot as ever, if not hotter. And so, at least to the extent people are claiming the credits, there's still a way to monetize them. Whereas, there's some fear that that would have been evaporated by the OB3.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, because although I was obviously the doomsayer there, the kind of parties that I deal with are not the kind of parties who can hire smart guys like Amish and Holland and Knight, right? They tend to be municipalities, community centers, tribal entities, and they rightfully, well, I don't know about rightfully assume, but they hear about the doom and gloom coming from HR1, OBBB, all the destructive environmental policies being put forth by the current administration, and they assume there is no silver lining. So it is important for us to remind people that there are still pathways here to take advantage of tax credits, to find real clean solutions for communities around the country.
So I'm going to jump back in as a chair, and I would be very curious as someone sitting sort of more in an academic position to maybe hear about hot issues that are playing out as you are having policy conversations with clients, colleagues, anything on the ground that you're hearing. And maybe we could do Tracy, Mike, Amish, then Seth. Tracy, take it away.
I mean, since I'm in an academic environment, I'm not talking to clients on a regular basis. My sense is that people are scrambling to try to get everything ready so that they can meet the place in service deadlines, the acquisition deadlines, and the beginning of construction deadlines. That was always the case with when I was doing affordable housing tax credit work. You were always trying to rush to meet that deadline. And so I think that that's a large share of what's going on right now. I think ultimately the law firms are not going to, even if they've represented solar and wind primarily in the past, because these tax credits are going to continue to be available, they're not going to see a downturn, because the fossil fuel industry, despite the fact that they don't really need capital to do these primary investments to build new things, they're getting all of these tax credits. And so we're going to see record profits among the fossil fuels, while no tax liability going forward.
Mike, what are you hearing on the ground from the folks that you're working with?
I'm hearing a complete lack of confidence in the ability to trust the United States federal government as a reliable partner going forward. To the extent, this administration came in with any credibility, I think it has lost it with most municipalities and certainly tribal governments around the country. People just don't even want to think about having to navigate the federal incentive structures, and often look to us for assistance on local and state incentives to fill the gap. And also, anecdotally, I was contacted by a journalist from a newspaper in an allied nation, let's say, who is besides himself considering some of the actions that the federal government has taken vis-a-vis some of these offshore wind farms versus, uh, foreign governments who are sovereign wealth funds who are controlling these things in Scandinavia, who view this very much as like a diplomatic slap in the face.
Amish, what are you hearing from clients, interlocutors, other attorneys, anything on the ground, hot issues?
Yeah, and what is I co-lead our alternative energy tax practice, so primarily in clean energy space, I'm exclusively in clean energy space, and I'd say the activity has been an upswing. I mean, it's been incredibly active since the IRA passed, and I think even since the OB3, it's become even more active in terms of what happens here, and this happened before, is that when there is a deadline, people start to act, and so we're seeing a huge rush to begin construction of solar and wind projects to get them in the queue. And so there's a huge rush on that. And I think the rules under OB3, again, I think people have found them to be relatively workable, even if they don't like them, they find them to be relatively workable, which, has obviously created more work for firms trying to understand and navigate folks through FIAC and the other new rules under OB3.
Yeah, that definitely seems, right to me. There's a kind of surge to get in under the deadlines. I think, one critical issue that's just going to become, maybe the one of the most important implementation issues for the tax credit provisions are the new foreign entity rules, which are really like incredibly complicated and extensive rules. They apply the more extensive rules apply just to the clean electricity production and investment tax credits and the manufacturing tax credits. There's some lighter rules that apply to a couple of the other energy credits. But there's a huge amount of uncertainty around those rules and how this administration will apply them. I think to Mike's point about, smaller entities and governments and nonprofits, like it's going to be hardest on, them to try to navigate these incredibly complex rules. The rules look to, there's different aspects of it, but the rules, the most difficult part of the rules looks to the sourcing of components that go within, into facilities or into batteries. And and the question is how far do you have to trace? And and it's essentially, sort of too much material or too many components produced by a Chinese company, essentially, or a Chinese owned company or a Chinese influence company. These are defined fairly broadly, can prohibit ineligibility, or sorry, can make a project ineligible. And there's a kind of fundamental question of how far up your supply chain you have to trace. I think we can read the law one way and I think the best way that this is reasonable. You should only have to look at major significant components. But the law is basically as clear as mud on these provisions, and I think there's a lot of developers in industry sort of asking the fundamental question of how far up the supply chain we have to trace, and how do we get assurance that we comply, because there's even new penalty provisions and a longer statute of limitations if you violate these rules. And then, unclear when Treasury is going to produce guidance. These are extremely complex issues, but a huge amount will be riding on that guidance, whether these rules will be workable or whether they'll be basically just another obstacle to clean energy deployment.
Thank you all very much for those perspectives, and in particular, the responses. We would now like to switch to a Q&A format and invite audience members. We do have one here, and anyone else, please feel free to join in. I'll put this to our panelists, and whoever wants to respond can feel free. Is industry seeing the ability to reach commence construction threshold in HR1 actually achievable? especially as the administration appears to be setting up roadblocks to the permitting process. Even land-based wind and solar have to obtain permitting from the likes of Army Corps of Engineers and so on. So is industry seeing the ability to reach that commence construction threshold in HR 1? Is that achievable?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Look, I think there's certainly more challenges from the perspective of getting permits and getting the ability to build and get the interconnect and to complete the project. And I think this question really goes to, if you began construction, as a general matter, you need to be completed within 4 years after the end of the year. So if you begin this year, by the end of 2029, if you begin next year, by the end of 2030. And so the question is, can you meet that 4-year requirement? Certainly, obviously, there are concerns for all the reasons that we've talked about earlier in terms of permitting and the like, and other attempts to stop solar and wind. What we're seeing, on the front end, what you need to do, even before you get to the 4-year window, is to do some physical work. And so there are a lot of developers who are seeing a path to being done within this period and are beginning construction. I will say the number one thing, in addition to transferability, we're spending time on right now is commencing construction on projects before the end of this year, because even though the deadline is really kind of July 3rd for under the statute, the deadline is really 12/31 of this year to avoid some of the FIAC rules that Seth was talking about. And so there's a big push. People are trying to do it, and I think understanding that there may be a challenging path on other fronts going forward and getting into that 4-year window.
Any other reactions to the ability to hit the threshold for commencement of construction?
The only thing I would say is that given that the Trump administration is deploying the Department of Defense, the Department of Interior, and as well as Health and Human Services to put a halt to various wind facilities completing construction, I would not be surprised if he also ordered a halt on the Army Corps of Engineers issuance of permits.
I would like to add a question as well while we have another question coming in from the audience. What centers of policy innovation are doing good responsive work in light of this shift? Is there sort of a light, fast-moving group on the ground who is being able to put policy machinery together fast enough to respond in creative ways and maybe salvage some of the momentum that existed under the IRA?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of groups out there that that provide technical support, and help taxpayers, meaning, developers or potential developers, comply with the rules. I mean, we're working with a number of allies. There was a webinar, Lawyers for Good Government is a group, and we just had a webinar actually with them this morning. And they're working hard with a lot of different partners, but trying to get technical advice to projects on these things that we've been talking about, like what is beginning of construction? How do we establish beginning construction under these new rules? How do we begin to think about the foreign entity rules? So that's just one example, but I know there's a number of other groups that are focused on different sectors, healthcare sector, and providing advice to the entities that are trying to take advantage of the incentives while they can.
On that point, we do have another question here. What recourse do foreign entities have that were left to deal with rollbacks from this?
not quite sure I understand the question, but so for, like the foreign entities of concern provision. So, I mean, I think the question is, there's a few questions, but under the law, essentially, are you a prohibited, is the taxpayer a prohibited foreign entity? And you have to look, the entity trying to claim the tax credit has to look at their ownership. They have to look at what debt they've issued. The rules are somewhat unclear, and sort of ask if they're a prohibited foreign entity. But then I think the more onerous rules have to do with, um, like I mentioned, projects having to trace their supply chain, or at least, components that go into their facilities. But then also there's restrictions on licensing and intellectual property agreements, but that are written in the law in a kind of not entirely clear way, um, where developers and taxpayers are having to review, potentially really broad set of different contracts to make sure that they don't trip up one of these rules, which could have major ramifications, in terms of losing tax credits or even having tax credits clawed back. Not sure that answered the question, but.
Yeah, I just add that, I mean, the executive order that I mentioned before that called for wind and solar guidance for began construction, it also had another requirement in there to provide fiat guidance. And so it directed Treasury to issue fiat guidance within 45 days. We're well past the 45-day mark. We haven't seen that fiat guidance yet, but I think reiterating a point from earlier, I think that guidance is going to be key to what we see in development going forward.
And just to pick up on that, I mean, so I was in the last administration where getting guidance out on the clean energy tax credits that had just been, enacted or expanded in IRA was one of the top administration priorities. And we were moving as fast as we could. This administration, I think, goes without saying, clean energy tax incentives is less of a priority in terms of creating clarity. But I think we're going to have to see, the sources of expertise within the government, both like Treasury, IRS, but also many of the technical agencies that we relied on to produce guidance, like the Department of Energy, EPA, have lost so many people and such knowledge, that it's just going to be, I think it's going to be more difficult to tackle these extremely complicated issues. And on top of that, OB3 is a really sweeping law, and there's they need to put out guidance on what what's a traditionally tipped industry for the no tax on tips policy and overtime. And there's hundreds of provisions within OB3 that are going to need tax guidance. So unclear their ability to provide, I think, timely guidance given all these, given everything else on their plate.
All right, with 1 minute and change left on our docket, are there any final comments before we wrap up at 1:45? And then I think we are free to commence the conclusion of the event. I want to thank everybody for their time. Thanks very much to all the institutions and to ATPI. The recording will be available on the ATPI website later in the week, so please check back there. Thank you to Mike Komersky, Amish Shah, Tracy Roberts, and Seth Hanlon, and of course to Bridget Crawford, for this very insightful and important conversation today. We really appreciate it. Thank you all.